Hello. Today we are going to talk on our reflections on what we learned while researching teacher well-being during the spring semester of ERT in Japan. The presenters are Wendy Gough, which is me, Colin Skeates, Bill Snyder, and Chiyuki Yanase. We decided to do this research project because in the spring 2020 semester, universities were suddenly thrust into emergency remote teaching in Japan. And what we found was there was a need for faculty development, but in the literature on faculty development, there isn't a distinction between part-time and full-time teachers. And we wanted to know what part-time teachers feel and give them a voice. So we started to conduct this project. Today's topics will be a reflection on the data as a teacher supervisor, technology integrated into pedagogy, what the emotion literature can tell us, and finally, the experience of ERT and how emotions change. So first, I will talk about faculty development and part-time teacher experiences. As a full-time teacher at my university, who is in charge of supervising the reading and writing skills teachers, this is an important topic to me because I want to know what kind of support and training teachers are getting from their universities. We found very little literature on this subject, and while claims are that faculty development at universities is supposed to be about teacher training or helping to learn new teaching techniques, emphasis tends to be placed on evaluating teaching practices and using student feedback to kind of give advice about different teaching ways. Also, there is not much literature that specifically focuses on part-time teacher faculty development experiences at universities, and we could only find one university, Tokai University, they're shown on campus, that actually has informal faculty development workshops at lunchtime. There is not literature about other universities that are doing this, so we're not sure how widespread that is in Japan. So the first part that I would like to talk about, this comes from our initial survey that we sent to part-time university teachers all over Japan just after Golden Week. You can see from the first part on the left, the online study experience. Many teachers that answered our survey have never studied anything online. Some have studied a hobby, and some have studied some kind of degree or certificate. These degrees and certificates range from something like the TESOL Principles and Practices of Online Teaching, a TESOL certification like a CELTA or DELTA, master's degrees, or doctorates. So it's really a broad range of things that people who have studied degrees online have done. But at the same time, many people don't actually have the experience of studying online. And I think this is important because it's hard to kind of envision how studying online works if you've never done it. And that might make it difficult for teachers to design their classes. Also, related to using applications in the classroom, we see quite a few people, 59 out of these 73 respondents, have used some type of technology app in their classroom, but only 2 people had fully taught online. So this shows that while some teachers might be familiar with some kinds of simple applications or online things to do in the class, they have no experience actually teaching online, which is what we were pushed into suddenly during ERT. So now this part is very interesting. This is related to the training that the part-time teachers received from the universities that they worked at. And remember, the part-time teachers generally teach most of the foreign language classes in a university, and they often work at several universities. So we can see that many people received some training from universities they worked at, or some training from all of the universities they worked at. Quite a few people received no training at all, and others said they were not sure if there was training. I think the people who said they are not sure if there is training, this could be because often information is sent out in Japanese and they might have missed it, or they might not have understood the emails. And also, many teachers before now either did not have a university-associated email account or did not know how to access their university-associated email account. So they might have been getting some information about training, but not knowing where it was. And also related to the length of training, only 2 people said they feel like they received long enough or just enough training to feel comfortable getting started on ERT. But many said it was not enough, and some just were kind of hopeful, like crossing their fingers, I hope so. What we found was the average length of training was only about 2 hours. So you can see that teachers really did not get much support initially from their universities. And I think that's a big problem because for many people, this online teaching was brand new to do, like completely online teaching. And also, some teachers were not sure whether they would receive ongoing training for ERT throughout the semester or after the semester finished. And so for me, as someone who supervises teachers at my school, this information is very useful because it helps me understand the part-time teacher's experience and what I can do to try and support the teachers I work with better. So I think that, for example, looking at the short amount of time that training was provided, I can think about ways that I need to develop better training for the teachers or be more available to give advice when they need it. And I think that even moving into the future, when we go back to regular classes or hybrid classes or something else, that it's important for me to keep this in mind and to do what I can to build strong relationships with the part-time teachers at my university.
All right, the second part has to do with the integration of technology into pedagogy. Now, there's 2 areas that I want to work on, that I want to focus on. One has to do with how the terms that we used in the research and how the participants' answers actually changed how I saw the literature. The second one has to do with why I think everybody, including part-timers, need to look more at the experiences that part-timers have while they teach at university. So the first part, I draw on this quote from teacher 22 of our study. She says, "The question about LMS draws attention away from the numerous other tools we are either required to use or have needed to find and master in order to teach effectively." This got me thinking. I went looking through the literature, and what I realized was there's a lot of terminology. There's like a whole set of lingo that I don't think most of us are familiar with, or at least I wasn't, as a full-timer. The idea of the difference between LMS, Learning Management System, and CMS, Course Management System. It's a very fine distinction, but they do very different things. And LMS is really something like XReader, or a system that manages vocabulary learning. It charts, quite literally, the learning that is taking place, whereas a CMS is more administrative. It deals with all aspects of a course, usually including grades. So this was probably the first thing that I thought was kind of interesting, how what we were doing in on the survey, how it limited our responses. We could have asked more precise questions or been more explicit in what we were looking for. The second area that I thought was kind of interesting was just looking at the sheer number of course management systems, CMSs, that teachers had to deal with. There was one teacher that was teaching at 5 different universities, and this teacher was also teaching in various faculties. Each probably had a different CMS. That is a lot to not only to learn, but also to master and feel confident when you're delivering a course online. As a result, we got many responses from teachers that were talking about how much work was involved in online teaching. Compared to the full-timer myself, I had one. And I had a lot of control over how I used that CMS. That is something that needs to be better understood. Doesn't mean that full-timers weren't busy. I was. But the experiences of the part-timers, my experiences pale in comparison. And that's something as a full-timer, and I think others involved in university administration need to better understand. Next, Bill will talk about emotion.
Hello. I came into this project being interested in teacher engagement. It's a topic that I've been working on for about 20 years. And so I really wanted to be involved in this because I thought it was really interesting to look at part-timers and how they might stay engaged in ERT. And when we first got our data in, I started to look at it and I found myself really confused. The data seemed to show mixed results of positive and negative feeling on the part of teachers. And I wanted to sort this out. So it led me into a plunge back into the literature that's available on emotion. And in particular, I found there's a big literature on teachers' emotional response to change. And ERT was certainly a big change. And reading through this literature, I want to pull out 3 key concepts I want to talk about. One of them is the notion of vulnerability, that teaching is a vulnerable profession. The second one I want to bring in is emotional geography. And this is about the network of relationships that teachers' work takes place within, with students, other teachers, administration, parents, although we're less concerned with that in this research, and other stakeholders potentially. And finally, what helped me make the most sense of our data was learning about the distinction between emotion and mood. Okay, and I want to just talk through these one at a time. Next slide. Yeah. So vulnerability, in the term of Keltermans et al., is about the fact that teachers don't really have full control of their situation, right? They lack control of the conditions under which they work. Those are shaped by other people. They have limited control of outcomes. Teachers can't predict based on what they're doing as teachers that students will necessarily learn, right? And finally, often teachers are making decisions in the moment. And if you ask them to go back and ask, why did you do that? They're often not able to say firmly why they did the things they did. They simply knew them. And all of this points to a real sort of instability, as I said, a lack of control in general that affects teachers' working lives. And I would argue that ERT heightened all of these, that under ERT, teachers who were unfamiliar with teaching online certainly lost much more control of the conditions under which they worked. The amount of uncertainty they had about outcomes grew, and And if they were really unfamiliar with working through ERT, being able to justify their decisions probably became even more difficult. Hargreaves introduced this concept of emotional geography, in which he uses this to talk about the relationships that teachers have with other people who influence their work. And there are 5 elements in Hargreaves' model. I want to talk about 3 of them that I think were affected by ERT. The first one is physical distance. For lots of teachers, being in the classroom with students creates a kind of intimate space in which they can get to know each other, and ERT broke that. It imposed greater physical distance between teachers and students. And this had the effect of also creating greater professional distance. In the Japanese context, teachers are expected to have more personal relationships with their students, right? To be more involved in their students' lives. And part of the ability to do that comes out of lack of physical distance as well, being in the classroom together. So the enforced physical distancing also created greater professional distance between teachers and students. The teacher became the teacher on the video screen, and the students were often with their cameras off, right? Disconnected. And so it created a kind of professional distance between teachers and students. There was also greater professional distance between teachers and the institutions they worked for. Wendy mentioned already teachers dealing with the flood of email, right? When teachers worked in physical school buildings where the administrators were right there, often they could walk into an office and solve a problem on the spot. Now, because of email communication, because of the delay and the asynchronicity, this became much more difficult. And finally, there's this notion of political distance. And this goes back to the whole issue of vulnerability and control. Most of the decisions about how to do ERT, about what CMS or LMS or apps people could use or not use, those were decisions that were taken out of teachers' hands and made by other people. And this also created political distance between teachers and the administrators at the institutions where they worked. All right. So when I looked at our data initially, looking at the 2 instruments that really measured this, we had an open-ended question about how teachers experienced doing ERT. And we got generally negative responses to this, right? Teachers would express how upset they were, how frustrated they were, how anxious they were. Lots of negative emotions, right, were mentioned in the open-ended question. But when I looked at the IPANAS SF, the positive affect, negative affect schedule, the results turned out to be generally positive. Right? How can we explain this difference? Both of them are measuring the same experience, but they're producing very different results. And what I got out of the literature on this is the difference between emotion and mood. Emotion is a short-term response to an event that happens in life. But mood is your general affective state. And even after some kind of emotional event, your affective state tends to reset to a norm. And so what we might be seeing here is that in the IPANAS SF, we're discovering that teachers are generally positive people, that their norm affective setting is relatively happy, looking forward. But the open-ended question brought them back to, in a sense, the shocks of starting to do ERT, the announcement that ERT was coming, the realization that they were not prepared and that they needed to prepare in a hurry. And all of these things generated a lot of negative emotion, which is what we saw in the open-ended answers. If we pull this all together, we might say we should be pretty glad that teachers tend to reset to a generally positive state. Although interestingly, in the data that we got, the things that brought teachers into positive affect were attentiveness and alertness. The lowest positive affect marker in the IPANAS SF for our teachers was inspiration. They were not feeling inspired. And I think that's a result of the political distance that grew between them and their institutions. What the decisions that their institutions were making were not making them feel like, I want to do this, but they were feeling like, I have to do this. And the other thing is, well, a lot of teachers did reset to a really positive norm, but mood is changeable, and relentless negative shocks, and the shocks from ERT were generally negative for most teachers. Relentless negative shocks can have a bad effect on mood and can lower it and can lead to issues with physical and mental health. And we do see that with some of the teachers that we looked at. And now Chiyuki Yanase, who is a full-time, part-time teacher, is going to talk about her experiences in doing ERT.
Okay, and I am only the part-time teacher among those researchers, so I will share my personal perspective. But from the data, it shows that a lot of part-time teachers shared this similar sentiment and perspectives towards ERT. So the first one is pre-ERT, and I was really anxious and stressed and overwhelmed because, and Wendy says, and Wendy and Colin and then Bill also pointed out that technological issues and lack of experiences online, and all those anxious features. Because of that, I was very overwhelmed. And also during the ELT, I was stressed, extremely stressed because of that, almost the same reasons. However, as Bill mentioned, my mood was very attentive and very positive overall in order to do my best. And I was a little bit exhausted, but still I was motivated to do the better job. And in post-ELT was, well, of course, I feel relieved yet exhausted. But also it was a really good time to reflect. And I'd like to share some of my reflections. So the first one is that benefits overall and ELT. The benefits was, of course, the safety for health. I didn't really have to go anywhere. I could work at home, which is quite fortunate. And also the other one is that even though the new technological knowledge was really challenging to develop, but I feel like I learned an extra teaching tool. So it was good. Integration was, I think, the positive aspect. And since I talk to the other part-timers constantly, and this is a shared sentiment. And also, as I mentioned, I often talk about with other part-timers, and collaborations and then support among the teachers happened. It's not only part-timers, but the full-timers on SNS as well. It wasn't really official, but it was more grassroots collaboration. It was really very, very positive aspect of ELT. Next one is the issue. I like to voice this one the most, actually. So an excessive workload, like Colin, I think, mentioned that. most of the part-timers work at the several universities, learning several types of LMS, and the workload, even for myself, individual sentiment, but it was maybe twice or three times as much as usual. And also health issue because of due to the workload, and we often talk feels the physical and mental health issues, which is also shared among the part-time teachers a lot. And also such as no financial aid from the universities. I really do think that administrational support, like a financial, technological, emotional help would be really, really needed for the part-timers. And that is including uncertainty of the faculty policy. Please do not really change during the semester, which happened to me and then other part-timers a lot. Hopefully in the future, we don't really have to deal with this uncertainty of the faculty policies or extreme lack of support from the universities. Okay, that's my part.
So, in closing, we'd like to say, first of all, thank you. Thank you to all the part-time teachers who participated in our study. From your answers to the initial survey and the survey that we sent out weekly, we were able to come up with various strands of research that we hope to publish in the very near future. One paper is called Teachers' Wellbeing over the course of the semester, and we're hoping that this paper will be finished by early 2021. A second paper, first authored by Bill, it deals with emotion, and it is tentatively called Japan-based part-time instructors' initial emotional response to ERT. The last one is one that I'm hoping to be the first author on. Is tentatively called Using TPAC to Chart Issues Arising from ERT. That has to do with how different aspects of teaching showed up in the responses. We'd like to thank you once again, and I hope that you have a wonderful conference. Thank you for this opportunity to present.